Poor girl's simple request for milk leaves millionaire shocked. What happened next will melt your heart. Sophia sat cross-legged on the cracked wooden floor, the faint light of a flickering candle casting long shadows on the peeling walls, her small hands tightly gripping the rim of an empty cup as though holding it might somehow fill it, while her baby brother's wails echoed painfully through the tiny room, each cry slicing into her heart like a sharp blade that she could not remove. And her mother, lying weakly on a thin mattress with hollow cheeks and sunken eyes, whispered in a voice so faint it seemed like it might vanish into the silence, "Stay home, Sophia. It's dangerous." Yet Sophia's eyes shimmered with tears that refused to fall because she wanted to be strong, she wanted to be brave, she wanted to be more than a child in that moment, and the sound of her brother's desperate cries grew louder, hungrier, pulling her toward a decision no 9-year-old should ever have to make. So she pressed the cup against her chest as if holding him close through it, her lips trembling, her small fists clenching around the handle, the fear of the unknown pressing against her ribs, but the weight of responsibility pressing harder, and for a moment her eyes darted to her mother, pale and exhausted, who tried to lift her hand but couldn't, who tried to smile but failed, whose voice broke once more, pleading, fragile, "Don't go, my little one." And Sophia closed her eyes tightly, the sound of those words cutting into her soul, yet the sharp sting of her brother's cries drowned them out. And she thought of how his tiny face scrunched up in hunger, how his lips searched for milk that wasn't there, how his little fists waved helplessly in the air. And she thought of how her mother's bones pressed against her skin, too frail to move, too weak to fight, too tired to even hope. And then she thought of herself, small and powerless, but standing between hunger and survival, between despair and maybe, just maybe, the chance of a miracle. So with a deep, shaky breath she rose to her feet, her bare toes curling against the cold floor, the emptiness in her stomach gnawing at her insides, but her determination burning stronger, and she stepped toward the wooden door with hesitant movements, each step heavy with fear, yet light with resolve, her heart thudding like a drum inside her chest as though urging her forward, her mind screaming of dangers that lurked outside. The dark alleys, the harsh faces, the cruel laughter she had heard before, but her soul whispering that she could not stay, not when her baby brother's cries filled the air like thunder, not when her mother's silence felt like surrender, not when an empty cup was the only thing standing between life and despair. So she reached for the rusty handle with trembling fingers, the metal cold and rough against her skin, and she pulled the door open slowly, the hinges groaning in protest, as if even the house itself wanted her to stay. But she pushed anyway, biting down on her lip to stop it from quivering, and the air outside hit her face, sharp and cold, carrying with it the smell of dust, smoke, and a faint trace of rain, and for a moment she froze, staring into the dimly lit street where shadows stretched long and unfriendly, where voices murmured somewhere far off, where the world felt too big for such a small girl with only an empty cup. But she held it tighter, pressing it against her chest like armor, and whispered softly to herself, "I have to," as if saying it aloud would make it real, as if speaking courage could plant it in her bones. And with that, she took her first step into the unknown, her bare feet touching the rough ground, the gravel biting her skin, the wind tangling through her dark hair, her eyes glistening with the determination of a child who had nothing left to lose, but everything left to protect. And though fear clawed at her heart, though her mother's warning echoed in her ears, though her brother's cries haunted every step, Sophia walked on, fragile yet fierce, small yet unyielding, into a night that held more than she could ever imagine, into a night that would change everything, into a night where destiny waited silently at the corner of the street, watching, waiting, ready to test the courage of a girl with an empty cup. Sophia's small frame moved cautiously down the dim street, the cup clutched tightly to her chest as though it carried all her hopes, her bare feet brushing against sharp stones, yet she didn't flinch, for her brother's cries still echoed in her ears like a call she could not ignore. and the world outside loomed vast and indifferent, filled with faces that turned away, eyes that refused to meet hers, voices that hushed as if her presence was an unwelcome shadow, and yet she whispered under her breath, almost like a prayer, "Just a little milk, that's all." Her voice trembling as it disappeared into the night, and the hunger in her belly gnawed at her, but she pressed on, her gaze flicking between the ground and the distant glow of street lamps that seemed far too dim to offer comfort, until suddenly the growl of an engine broke through the silence, deep and powerful, rolling like thunder across the narrow street, and she stopped in her tracks, her tiny heart racing at the unfamiliar sound. Her eyes widening as a long black car with shining chrome edges glided slowly into view, its polished surface reflecting the weak light like a shadowed mirror, and she froze, unsure whether to run or to stay, because cars like that did not belong in her world. They belonged to another life entirely, one she had only seen from afar, yet as it stopped just a few feet away from her, the silence of the night seemed to bow to its presence, and the door swung open. With a heavy click, revealing a tall man stepping out, his shoes polished to a shine, his coat dark and pressed, his movements steady and certain, as though he owned not just the car but the entire street. And Sophia's breath caught, her fingers tightening around the empty cup, because she had never stood this close to such a figure before. A man who looked like he belonged to power itself, and the driver rushed to his side, bowing slightly, while another assistant held a phone pressed to his ear, whispering quickly. But the man ignored them, his sharp eyes scanning the street until, by chance or by fate, they landed on her, the small girl standing barefoot, her hair tangled, her face pale yet defiant, clutching nothing but a cup, and she felt her knees weaken under the weight of his gaze. Yet something inside her urged her to speak before fear swallowed her whole. So with trembling lips, she tugged at the edge of his coat, her voice so soft it was almost lost in the wind. "Sir, can I please have some milk?" And though the words were simple, they carried the weight of every hunger, every tear, every sleepless night she had endured. And the man, Mr. Adrian, froze in place, his jaw tightening, his cold expression flickering for the briefest moment, as though something inside him cracked, and his assistants exchanged bewildered glances, some suppressing scoffs, others shaking their heads, as if this was beneath their master. But Adrian did not move. He did not speak. He simply stared at her, his silence heavier than any words, and Sophia, her courage slipping away, quickly added in a whisper, "I promise I'll pay you back when I grow up." Her tiny voice breaking at the edges, but her eyes wide and shining with innocence. And for a heartbeat the world seemed to stop, the night itself holding its breath, the hum of the car engine fading beneath the fragile sound of a little girl's vow, and Adrian's heart, one he believed long turned to stone, stirred with something unfamiliar, something he thought he had buried long ago, and yet he remained silent. His face unreadable, his body frozen between pride and compassion, his mind torn between walking away and leaning down, and Sophia's fingers trembled against his coat as she whispered again, more faintly now, "Please, sir." And the empty cup shook in her hands as if it too knew the weight of her desperation, and in that moment, surrounded by wealth, by power, by shadows that had never known hunger, the small child's request pierced through it all like a fragile ray of light cutting into darkness. Yet Adrian's lips remained sealed, his chest rising and falling as though fighting a battle invisible to everyone else, his eyes locked on hers, her innocence mirrored in the trembling reflection of his gaze, and for the first time in years, he found himself unable to look away, unable to dismiss, unable to ignore. Yet still, he stood in silence, his world crashing against hers, two lives colliding in a way neither had ever expected, and in that collision lay the seed of a choice that would shape everything to come, though in that moment all Sophia knew was that the man before her had yet to answer, had yet to move, had yet to decide, and her heart thudded louder with each second of his silence, until the night seemed to echo only with her question and his unspoken response, hanging heavy in the air like a storm waiting to break. Adrian's breath lingered in the cold night air as the silence between him and the little girl stretched unbearably long, his assistants shifting impatiently, one whispering under his breath that they should leave, another scoffing that a man of his stature had no business wasting time on beggars. And yet Adrian's eyes never left Sophia's trembling hands, the way her small fingers clutched the cup as though it was her last shield against a world that had already turned its back on her, and within him something stirred, something uncomfortable, something he did not want to acknowledge, a voice that whispered from deep inside, reminding him of days long buried, of nights when he too had known hunger, though he had spent years covering those memories with money, success, and a fortress of coldness. And now here stood a child, pulling at that wall, with nothing more than innocence, and the weight of the moment pressed against his chest like a heavy stone. Yet pride and habit fought viciously within him, urging him to look away, to step into his car, to drive off and forget her face before it carved itself into his mind. But her words replayed, soft but sharp. "I promise I'll pay you back when I grow up," echoing again and again until it wrapped around his thoughts like chains, and he found himself caught between two worlds, the one he had built with power and the one this child represented with need, and his jaw tightened as his driver leaned closer, murmuring, "Sir, we're late." But Adrian waved him off with a flick of his hand, his gaze still locked on Sophia, who now looked down at the ground as though ashamed, as though she regretted even asking, and the sight of her fragile shoulders drooping under the weight of silence hit him harder than he expected, because she was not begging for money, not asking for luxury, not demanding anything beyond a simple cup of milk. And the purity of that request gnawed at him like guilt, a feeling he thought he had outgrown, and he inhaled sharply, torn, his chest rising and falling like a man wrestling invisible battles, until finally he bent down slightly, his voice low and firm. "Where is your home?" And Sophia's eyes shot up, wide with surprise, her lips parting but no words escaping, as though she could not believe what she had just heard, and his assistants exchanged startled glances, one muttering in disbelief, "Sir, this is absurd." But Adrian ignored them, his stare never wavering. From the girl's pale face, his tone harder now, as if to disguise the softness breaking through. "Show me where you live." And for a heartbeat Sophia hesitated, her little hands shaking as the empty cup rattled faintly, unsure if she could trust him, unsure if this towering man in his fine clothes meant kindness or something else, but the desperate thought of her brother's cries filled her mind and gave her courage. And she nodded slowly, almost imperceptibly, before taking a small step back toward the street, glancing over her shoulder to see if he would follow, and Adrian straightened, his coat rustling as he moved, ignoring the murmurs of protest behind him, ignoring the questioning stares of his men, because something within him had already shifted, something he couldn't yet explain but couldn't resist. And though he walked with the same commanding stride, there was a flicker in his chest, a tremor in his thoughts, a whisper that maybe, just maybe, he was about to step into something far larger than himself. Yet he pressed forward, his shadow falling over the small girl who clutched her cup tighter than ever, her tiny feet already carrying her toward the darkened end of the street. And as she led him deeper into the silence of the night, his mind churned with questions he dared not voice, his heart pounding with a rhythm he hadn't felt in years. And though his face remained unreadable, his soul trembled with the weight of a choice that once made could never be undone, and the night itself seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for him to decide whether to turn back to the world he knew or follow the fragile figure before him into the unknown shadows that could change everything. And still, despite every reason to walk away, his steps carried him after her, though what awaited beyond those shadows he could not yet imagine. The night deepened as Sophia's small figure led Adrian through twisting alleys that grew darker with each step, the glittering city lights fading behind them until, the broken lamps flickered weakly overhead, casting long, jagged shadows that made the narrow path seem endless, and the sound of her bare feet against gravel echoed softly, fragile against the heavy footsteps of the man following her, his polished shoes clicking like a foreign rhythm in this forgotten place. And with every turn the streets grew narrower, the walls more cracked, the silence more suffocating, as if the world itself had abandoned this corner of the city. And yet Sophia pressed forward, glancing back only once to make sure the tall stranger was still behind her, her eyes wide with both fear and hope, while Adrian, though outwardly composed, felt a strange unease settle into his chest, because this was not a world he belonged to, not a street he had ever walked, and the stench of damp wood and stale air filled his lungs, mingling with a heaviness he could not shake. Until finally, Sophia stopped in front of a crumbling building whose plaster peeled like old skin, whose windows sagged under the weight of time, whose door hung crooked on rusty hinges, and for a moment she stood there silently, clutching her empty cup against her chest, her lips pressed together as though ashamed to show him where she came from. But Adrian's eyes followed every detail: the broken steps, the graffiti-stained walls, the faint sound of coughing from within, and something in him shifted. A recognition he did not want, a memory of places he had sworn to forget. And Sophia, gathering her courage, pushed open the door with a low groan of wood against wood, revealing a dim interior where the single bulb flickered weakly, casting trembling light across the room. And inside, a thin woman lay on a mattress barely lifted from the floor, her face pale, her eyes heavy with exhaustion, her breath shallow as though each one cost more than she could pay. And beside her, a baby whimpered, his cries soft now from weakness rather than relief, and Sophia's small steps quickened as she ran to her mother, kneeling beside her, placing the empty cup gently at her side, as if it had already served its purpose by leading her here. And she whispered, her voice breaking, "Mama, I found someone," while Adrian lingered in the doorway, the sight before him striking harder than he expected, because here was not just poverty, not just need, but a family balancing on the edge of survival, a mother clinging to life, children clinging to her, and in that fragile scene, all the walls he had built around himself cracked a little more, and though his face remained cold, his heart thudded with an unfamiliar ache, and he stepped inside, his shoes pressing against the uneven floorboards, each creak sounding like an intrusion, and Sophia's mother turned her head slightly, her eyes struggling to focus, narrowing at the sight of a tall stranger in fine clothes, her weak voice catching in suspicion. Who are you?" And Sophia quickly held her mother's hand, shaking her head, whispering, "He wants to help, Mama." But the woman's lips trembled, torn between gratitude and fear. For men like him did not enter places like this without reason, and Adrian, for once, found no words, only silence, as he looked at the frail figure before him, at the baby's tiny fists reaching helplessly, at the peeling walls that seemed to hold centuries of suffering, and his chest tightened with a heaviness that money had never taught him to carry. Yet before he could speak, a sudden sound erupted, sharp and jarring, a pounding at the door so loud it rattled the fragile hinges, making the bulb above flicker wildly, and Sophia froze, clutching her mother's arm, her eyes darting to the doorway with fear, while Adrian straightened instinctively, his shoulders squaring as though bracing for something unseen, and the pounding came again, harder, more furious, filling the room with dread, and in that instant, the fragile moment of quiet broke in part, replaced by a tension that wrapped around them all like a vice, and Sophia's mother, her face pale with terror, whispered shakily, "It's him. He's back." But her voice was barely audible over the sound of the door shaking under the force of fists, and Adrian's jaw tightened, his hand balling into a fist at his side, his mind racing, his body already leaning toward the entrance, because though he did not yet understand the full weight of what was coming, he knew one thing with certainty: the fragile safety of this room was about to shatter, and the decision he had thought he made outside was nothing compared to the one now pressing against the other side of that door. The pounding at the door grew louder, each strike rattling the fragile frame as though it would splinter apart, and Sophia clung to her mother, her small body trembling, while the baby's weak cries rose in frightened harmony with the echo of fists against wood, the dim bulb above swaying slightly, as if even the light feared what waited outside, and Adrian, his tall figure casting a shadow across the tiny room, narrowed his eyes at the door, his jaw locked tight, his mind sharpening like a blade, because danger had a sound, and it was here now, demanding to be answered, and the mother's voice broke the silence in a weak, trembling whisper. "It's the landlord. He comes every month, angrier each time," her words trailing off into a cough that racked her frail frame, and Sophia's eyes filled with tears, her voice small but fierce. "Please, Mama, don't be scared." Though she herself was shivering, clutching the cup so hard her knuckles whitened, and the door shuddered again under the assault, a voice booming from the other side, cruel and impatient. "Open this door or I'll break it down." And Adrian's gaze flicked toward the mother, her thin hand clutching the edge of the mattress, her lips trembling with the shame of debts unpaid, and then toward Sophia, who looked back at him with pleading eyes that said what she could not voice, and the pounding continued, louder, angrier, filling the small apartment with dread, until Adrian, with slow, deliberate steps, moved toward the door, his polished shoes clicking against the uneven floor, his shoulders squared, his presence filling the cramped space like an unspoken promise. And as he reached the handle, the landlord's voice barked again, dripping with disdain. "I know you're in there. Don't hide from me. Pay what you owe or get out." And Adrian paused, his hand hovering over the handle, his expression unreadable, though inside his chest a storm brewed. A clash between the cold businessman he had always been and the stirring anger of a man confronted with cruelty. And he could hear Sophia's soft sobs behind him, her mother's labored breathing, the baby's helpless cries, and it all coiled into a single burning flame that pushed against the ice of his composure. And finally, with a slow exhale, he wrapped his hand around the handle and turned it, the rusty hinges groaning as the door creaked open, revealing a man on the threshold, stout and broad, his clothes unkempt, his face twisted in a sneer that spoke of years of unchecked power over the powerless. And the landlord's eyes flicked over Adrian with surprise before narrowing in suspicion. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded, his tone sharp, his breath hot with anger, and behind him the shadows of the hallway seemed to press in, amplifying his presence. But Adrian did not flinch, his voice calm, measured, but edged with steel. "I'm here to talk," and the landlord laughed harshly, spitting onto the floor. "Talk? There's nothing to talk about. They owe me 3 months, and if they don't pay tonight, they're out on the street." His words striking like blow. Ness and Sophia whimpered, burying her face against her mother's side, while the baby let out another thin cry. But Adrian's gaze remained fixed, his voice colder now. "How much?" And the landlord blinked, taken aback, then smirked, tilting his head. "Too much for anyone to pay for them. Unless you're here to cover it, rich man," his tone dripping with mockery, testing the resolve of this stranger who did not belong in these crumbling walls, and for a long moment the air thickened. The silence between them weighted with hostility, the mother's shallow breaths rasping in the background, Sophia's heart thudding as she peered from behind the mattress, and Adrian's hand tightened at his side, his eyes hardening as though something deep within him had settled, a decision carved into stone, and yet he did not answer immediately, letting the weight of his silence hang heavy, letting the landlord's sneer deepen, until finally the man stepped forward, jabbing a finger into Adrian's chest, his voice rising. "If you're not here to pay, then get out of my way, because I'll drag them out myself." And at that moment, the baby wailed louder, the mother cried weakly, and Sophia gasped, her eyes wide with fear, and Adrian's hand shot up, catching the landlord's wrist before it could strike the air again. His grip firm, unyielding, his voice a low growl now, controlled, but dangerous. "No one drags them anywhere." And the landlord's smirk faltered, his bravado wavering under the weight of the unshakable force before him, yet still he tried to pull free, snarling, "You don't scare me." But Adrian's grip tightened, and the silence that followed was louder than any threat, filled with the heavy truth that something was about to change, that this night was no longer in the landlord's control. And though Sophia didn't understand the depth of the storm gathering in that moment, she knew one thing wait. A certainty. This man who had stepped from the black car was not leaving them to the mercy of cruelty, but what he would do next, what he would say, what choice he would make in this fragile, dangerous instant. None of them could yet know, as the dim light trembled above, and the landlord's eyes widened under the weight of a power he hadn't expected to face in the crumbling walls of the home he thought he ruled. The silence after Adrian's words stretched across the room like a heavy curtain, the landlord's sneer faltering as the weight of his wrist trapped in Adrian's grip reminded him that he was no longer the strongest man in the space, and Sophia, still clutching the empty cup, peered out from behind her mother's frail body with wide eyes that reflected both fear and a fragile spark of hope, while the baby's cries pierced the tension, a desperate reminder of why this moment mattered, and Adrian, standing tall, his expression carved in steel, finally released the landlord's wrist with deliberate calm, his voice low but sharp enough to cut through the stale air. "Leave, now." And for the first time the landlord hesitated, his bravado crumbling as he glanced from Adrian's unyielding gaze to the fragile family huddled in the shadows, then back again, before spitting onto the ground and muttering, "Fine, but they'll starve without me," though his words lacked the venom they once carried, and with a bitter scowl he turned and stormed down the hallway, his heavy steps echoing away until the sound faded into nothing, and the fragile door closed with a soft click as Adrian pulled it shut, the sudden quiet in the room pressing down like the calm after a violent storm, and Sophia's mother sagged against the mattress, her breath ragged, her eyes wet with both relief and shame, whispering through trembling lips, "Why? Why would you help us?" Her voice cracking under the weight of years of humiliation, but Adrian did not answer immediately, instead kneeling down before Sophia, who clutched the cup tighter, as though the empty vessel was her last piece of strength, and he looked into her tear-streaked face, his own eyes softening in a way they hadn't in years, and he asked quietly, "Little one, why did you step into the night?" And her small voice, quivering yet fierce, answered, "Because my brother needed milk. And I promised I would pay back someday when I grow up." Her words innocent yet so heavy, they struck something deep inside him, breaking through walls of pride and wealth that had long numbed his heart. And for a moment, Adrian saw not just a child before him, but a reflection of something he had lost, his own younger self, abandoned, hungry, desperate for kindness. And he swallowed hard, blinking against a sting in his eyes, before placing his large hand gently over the cup, his voice trembling slightly despite his efforts to keep it steady. "You don't need to wait until you grow up. Tonight, you don't owe me anything." And he rose, pulling his phone from his pocket, his commanding tone returning as he spoke into it, summoning his driver, his assistant, his world of resources, and within an hour the small apartment was filled with groceries, warm blankets, and even a doctor who checked the frail mother and the fragile baby, while Sophia stood frozen, unable to understand how a single stranger had changed the night from despair to hope, and her mother, tears streaming down her hollow cheeks, whispered again, "Why? Why us?" And Adrian finally answered, his voice soft, as if he were confessing a truth long buried. "Because once I was you, and someone chose to save me," his words hanging in the air like a revelation. And in that instant, the walls he had built around his soul cracked wide open, exposing the man behind the millionaire, the man who had once been a child with nothing but an empty stomach and silent prayers. And as dawn crept through the broken window, painting the room in shade of gold, Adrian remained seated beside them, refusing to leave until he was sure they were safe, until Sophia's mother could breathe easier, until the baby slept peacefully with a full belly, and Sophia, exhausted but still clutching the cup, leaned against him, her eyes heavy, whispering with childlike sincerity, "You're not like other rich men, you're kind." And her words pierced him deeper than any business deal or boardroom victory ever had, for they were pure, unfiltered truth, spoken from the mouth of innocence. And in that fragile moment, Adrian felt a transformation ripple through him, as if the emptiness that wealth could never fill had finally been touched by something greater. And he knew, with unshakable certainty, that his life would never return to what it had been before this night. Because in a crumbling apartment with peeling wallpaper and a flickering bulb, A 9-year-old girl with an empty cup had reminded a millionaire of what it truly meant to be human. And as he stepped outside at last, the sun warming his face, he glanced back once more, his heart heavy yet light, knowing this was not an ending, but a beginning, for the story of Sophia and her family was now tied to his forever. And though the world would never know the details of this night, Adrian knew he had witnessed a miracle, not of wealth, but of love, courage, and the unbreakable spirit of a child who simply asked for milk